Have you ever been told you're overreacting by the people who are supposed to know you best? That your feelings don't really matter, that you're just being too sensitive or dramatic? It's a question that haunts me because for years, that was my reality. Living under the same roof as my family meant constantly walking on eggshells, never quite trusting my own emotions. Every time I expressed discomfort or tried to set a boundary, the response was the same: you're making a big deal out of nothing, or calm down, you're overreacting. It was exhausting and painful in ways that words barely capture. When you're surrounded by people who dismiss your feelings, you start to doubt yourself. You wonder if you're really too sensitive or if you're imagining things. I spent countless moments questioning whether my pain was valid or if I was just being dramatic, as they said. The house that should have been a sanctuary turned into a place of confusion and emotional turmoil. I felt invisible in my own family, like my feelings were a problem to be ignored rather than a truth to be acknowledged. But what hurts most isn't just the dismissal, it's how it becomes a pattern. The more I tried to explain how their behavior affected me, the louder the chorus of "you're too dramatic" grew. It felt like my emotions were a tool they used to keep control. I was trapped in a cycle where my attempts to be heard only reinforced their belief that I was unstable or overly emotional. It was a quiet kind of gaslighting, subtle but deeply damaging. Stay with me until the end, because what happened when I stopped reacting changed everything. I realized that every time I defended myself, every time I tried to make them understand, I was actually feeding into the dynamic. My reactions were part of what kept the cycle alive. So I made a choice, not to argue, not to confront, and not to make a scene. I simply went completely silent. That silence wasn't a dramatic exit or a fiery confrontation. It was a quiet withdrawal that shifted the balance in ways I never expected. It wasn't peace at first. It was tension, confusion, and a slow unraveling of the family dynamic that had depended on my emotional availability. Without my reactions, the unspoken rules began to surface. The silence exposed more than any argument ever could. This story isn't just about feeling dismissed or misunderstood. It's about emotional invalidation, the subtle gaslighting that happens inside families, and how sometimes the most powerful response isn't to fight back, it's to stop playing the role you've been cast in. What followed after that silence changed everything. If you've ever been told you're just being dramatic, or that you're overreacting when your feelings felt so real and heavy, this might resonate with you more than you expect. I know what it's like to carry that weight, the frustration of being dismissed not because what you feel isn't valid, but because the people who should understand you refuse to listen. This isn't about cutting people off in anger or walking away with resentment. It's something quieter, more profound. It's about choosing not to explain yourself anymore to those who've already decided they won't hear you. You might recognize yourself in what comes next, those moments when silence stretches longer than any argument, when the absence of reaction feels louder than any shout. It's strange how stopping the cycle of trying to justify your emotions can reveal things that words never did. Things that make everyone involved uncomfortable, but also open a space for something new to emerge, even if it's not immediately visible. Stay with me, because what happened when I stopped reacting changed everything. In that stillness, I started to see the invisible lines drawn beneath our interactions, the unspoken expectations, the silent judgments, the subtle ways my truth was turned into someone else's story. It wasn't easy to face, and it wasn't easy to hold that quiet space without filling it with explanations or defenses. But that silence became a mirror, reflecting not just what I had been carrying alone, but what was quietly shaping the whole family dynamic. This isn't a story about winning or losing. It's about what happens when you stop trying to fit into a role that's been assigned to you and instead claim the space to simply be, without apology, without performance. It's about finding clarity in the quiet and realizing that sometimes, the most powerful change begins with simply refusing to play along. For years, every time I tried to share what I was feeling, the response was the same, a swift dismissal, as if my emotions were less than real. My concerns were met not with empathy or understanding, but with a kind of weary impatience, as though I was deliberately making mountains out of molehills. "You're just being dramatic," they'd say, or, "Why do you have to be so sensitive about everything?" Those words, repeated over and over, became a relentless echo in my mind, slowly eroding my confidence in what I felt. It was as if my emotions were a performance to be judged rather than an authentic experience to be respected. This pattern wasn't limited to one or two moments, it stretched across years, weaving itself into every conversation where I dared to express vulnerability. Raising a concern, whether about something small or something deeply important, was like stepping into quicksand. The more I struggled to be heard, the more I was pulled under by accusations of exaggeration. I began to anticipate the dismissals, the eye rolls, the sighs of exasperation before I even spoke. It wasn't just that my feelings were ignored, they were actively minimized, turned into a spectacle of unwarranted drama. I started to question if I was too sensitive, if maybe I was making things worse than they really were. But beneath that doubt was a heavier truth: I was learning not to trust myself. The cumulative effect of this constant invalidation was profound. It felt like a slow, invisible conditioning, one that taught me to silence my inner voice, to second-guess the very essence of my emotional reality. When your feelings are repeatedly labeled as overreactions, you begin to wonder if the problem lies not with the situation but with you. This self-doubt crept into every corner of my psyche, blurring the line between genuine emotion and imagined hysteria. I became hyper-aware of how I might appear to others, carefully editing what I said, how loudly I expressed pain or frustration, desperately trying not to give anyone reason to dismiss me yet again. At times, this internal conflict was exhausting. I wanted to scream that my feelings were valid, that they deserved recognition, but the fear of being branded dramatic held me back. It was easier to shrink, to fold in on myself quietly, to bury the turmoil deep inside where no one could find it. The irony was that this withdrawal only made the accusations more believable to those around me. If I wasn't visibly upset, how could my feelings be so intense? Yet inside, the suppressed emotions churned, unacknowledged and unresolved. Reflecting now, I see how this dynamic shaped the way I relate to my own inner world. The years of being dismissed taught me to be cautious with my emotions, to treat them like fragile glass that could shatter if handled too openly. But they also planted a seed of resilience, a quiet, stubborn refusal to let my truth be erased. The process of undoing that learned self-doubt is ongoing, a slow unraveling of the years spent convincing myself that my feelings were less than real. It means reclaiming the right to feel without apology, to trust in my perceptions even when others do not. This journey has illuminated the deep cost of invalidation, not just in how others see us, but in how we come to see ourselves. It's a reminder that emotional honesty is not a weakness, nor is sensitivity a flaw to be corrected. Instead, they are integral parts of being human, deserving of respect and space. The challenge, then, is to break free from the shadows cast by years of dismissal and to learn, finally, to stand firmly in my own emotional truth. From early on, I was taught that my feelings were not merely my own but something that had to be carefully managed, explained, and justified to a scrutinizing audience that never seemed satisfied. There was an unspoken but rigid expectation that I remain emotionally accessible at all times, never retreating into silence or withdrawal, because silence was perceived as a threat, a sign of defiance or detachment that could unravel the fragile balance maintained under the same roof. This constant demand to perform emotional transparency was not an invitation to genuine connection but a mechanism of control, a way to keep me tethered to their narrative and available for their needs. When I reacted, whether with sadness, frustration, or joy, I was expected to articulate exactly why, to dissect my emotions aloud, to demonstrate that I was not only feeling but also thinking in ways that aligned with their understanding. There was little room for ambiguity or private processing. My internal world had to be laid bare and scrutinized. If I failed to meet this expectation, if I hesitated or withheld explanation, the silence that followed was met with suspicion and discomfort. The family could not tolerate the void because it broke the illusion of harmony and control. In their eyes, silence was not neutrality but resistance, a refusal to participate in the emotional economy they had established. This dynamic turned my emotional responses into tools wielded against me. The demand to justify my feelings became a form of interrogation, where vulnerability was weaponized to maintain power. It was as if my inner experience were a puzzle they needed to solve, not to understand me better, but to keep me within prescribed boundaries. I learned quickly that expressing emotions was not about seeking empathy, but about proving my compliance. Any deviation from this script, a delayed reaction, an unspoken thought, was met with pressure, sometimes overt, sometimes subtle, to fill the silence and reaffirm my availability. The refusal to allow silence was deeply connected to the earlier patterns of invalidation I described. Where before my feelings were dismissed or minimized, now they were demanded and dissected, as if overexposure would somehow guarantee control. This relentless scrutiny left no space for private reflection or emotional rest. It was exhausting to be perpetually on, to feel that every expression of feeling had to be justified and monitored. The pressure to stay emotionally available created a paradox. I was never allowed to fully own my feelings on my own terms because they always belonged, in part, to others. Over time, this environment shaped how I perceived my emotions and myself. The act of explaining, justifying, and performing emotional availability became so ingrained that I struggled to separate what I felt from what I thought I was supposed to feel or say. Silence, which should have been a refuge, a chance to gather myself or simply exist without explanation, instead became a battleground. I learned to fear silence not because it was empty, but because it threatened the fragile order of control that held the family together. It was a silence that screamed louder than words. This constant emotional exposure, rather than fostering connection, bred distance. It created a barrier between my authentic self and the version I presented to satisfy the expectations imposed on me. The demand for explanation and availability was less about genuine care and more about maintaining a system where my feelings were controlled, surveilled, and ultimately used to reinforce existing power dynamics. To break free from this meant confronting not only the past invalidation but also the ongoing pressure to perform emotional transparency, a challenge that required reclaiming silence not as absence but as a space for self-sovereignty. Understanding this dynamic is crucial because it reveals how control operates not just through overt dismissal, but through the compulsion to constantly reveal and justify one's inner world. The family's intolerance of silence was a way to prevent any emotional autonomy, to keep me perpetually vulnerable and accessible to their influence. Recognizing this pattern is a step toward reclaiming my right to feel, to pause, and to be fully present with my emotions on my own terms, without needing to explain, justify, or perform for an audience that never truly listened. The moment came quietly, without fanfare or dramatic revelation. It was not a burst of anger or a sudden outcry but rather a gentle, almost imperceptible easing within, a stillness that settled deep into my core. Up until then, I had been caught in a relentless cycle, one where every pause in conversation felt like an invitation to fill the silence with explanations, justifications, or defenses. My voice, once a tool for expression, had become a shield, a way to stay visible and relevant in a household that feared absence and misunderstanding. But in that precise instant, something shifted. I realized that the weight I carried, the exhausting need to respond, to clarify, to prove, was not mine to bear alone. It was a burden imposed, a demand that I be perpetually accessible, perpetually readable. As the silence stretched out before me, I felt no urgency to break it. Instead of the familiar flutter of anxiety or the creeping compulsion to speak, there was a calm that wrapped around me like a soft blanket. It wasn't the calm of resignation, nor the calm of defeat. It was a profound, quiet clarity that came from recognizing a choice where before I had only seen obligation. I could stop explaining. I could stop reacting. I could simply be. This realization was not loud or forceful. It was a gentle invitation to rest, to reclaim a space that had long been denied. In that space, I noticed how my breath slowed and deepened, how the tightness in my chest began to unwind. The constant mental chatter, the rehearsed defenses, the rehearsed explanations, fell away, leaving room for something more authentic. It felt like stepping out of a storm into a still, clear morning. There was no need to convince anyone of my truth, no need to perform for an audience that had never truly seen me. The silence was no longer a threat, but a refuge. This shift was not an act of defiance, but an act of self-respect. I was not shutting down or building walls. I was opening a door to a quieter, steadier way of existing. The impulse to justify myself, to fill every gap with words, was replaced by a gentle acceptance of what simply was. I understood that silence did not equal weakness or invisibility. It was a space where I could reconnect with my own feelings, unfiltered and unmediated. As I sat with this newfound calm, I recognized how much energy I had spent trying to control others' perceptions, trying to manage their expectations and fears. The decision to stop defending myself was a decision to stop giving away my power. It was the moment I chose to honor my own experience without apology, to hold my emotions tenderly without the need for external validation. The world around me remained unchanged, but inside, a quiet revolution had taken place. The relentless need to explain, justify, or argue had dissolved into a serene acceptance. This was not about winning or losing, it was about reclaiming a sense of peace, an internal sanctuary where I could simply exist, fully and freely, without performance or defense. And in that stillness, I found a strength that was calm, steady, and deeply mine. The first moments after I stopped speaking were almost imperceptible, like a gradual dimming of light rather than a sudden blackout. At first, no one seemed to notice. The hum of daily life continued under the same roof, but as minutes stretched into hours, the absence of my voice began to ripple through the atmosphere. Conversations that once bounced back and forth with ease now hit an invisible wall. My family members, accustomed to the familiar rhythm of my words, started to navigate this new silence with increasing uncertainty. At the breakfast table, forks paused mid-air as my mother glanced up, her brow furrowing ever so slightly. She cleared her throat, opening her mouth as if to speak, then hesitated, swallowing the words. The usual morning chatter, the weather, plans for the day, stalled like a record skipping on its first groove. My siblings exchanged quick, uneasy looks, as if trying to decode a puzzle that had suddenly lost its key. Their eyes flickered towards me, searching for some sign, some spark of recognition, but all they found was calm stillness. The subtle shifts in behavior were unsettling. My father, who typically filled the room with a steady stream of commentary, found himself quieter, his sentences trailing off mid-thought. He would start to say something, then close his mouth tightly, choosing gestures over words, nods instead of explanations. There was a growing tension in the way he tapped his fingers on the kitchen counter, a silent impatience that clashed with his otherwise composed demeanor. My siblings, too, seemed caught in a delicate dance around the silence. Their casual teasing, once a constant background noise, faltered. Jokes that would normally fly effortlessly fell flat, hanging awkwardly in the air before being abandoned. I noticed how they would glance at each other, eyebrows raised, questioning the change they couldn't quite put into words. The living room, which used to echo with shared stories and playful banter, felt oddly vacant. The TV's volume was turned up slightly, as if trying to fill the void I'd left behind, but the noise only seemed to highlight the absence. Even the small routines began to shift. When I entered a room, conversations would pause. People would look up, their expressions unreadable, caught between concern and confusion. Meals were eaten in quieter clusters, without the usual invitations to join in lively exchanges. At times, I sensed a barely perceptible cringe when eyes met mine, an unspoken question, "Why won't you speak? Why this sudden withdrawal?" But no one asked out loud. Instead, they retreated into their own thoughts, creating invisible barriers that made the distance feel wider. The atmosphere thickened with unease. It was not the storm of anger or frustration I might have expected, but a slow-building discomfort that settled like a weight. I could feel it pressing in from every corner of the house, an intangible force that made the air heavy. There were moments when I caught my mother's gaze lingering just a bit too long, her lips pursed as if debating whether to break the silence. My father's sighs became deeper, his posture stiffening ever so slightly, as if bracing himself against an unseen tension. At night, the quiet became almost palpable. The usual sounds, footsteps in the hallway, murmurs from the next room, were muted. I realized that my silence had created a vacuum, one that sucked the familiar warmth from our shared space and replaced it with a tentative stillness. Family members moved more cautiously around me, their voices lowered, their smiles subdued. It was as if they were walking on thin ice, afraid that the smallest misstep might shatter the fragile balance. Despite the discomfort radiating from those around me, I remained anchored in my resolve. Their confusion and irritation were not directed with malice but stemmed from a place of uncertainty, an instinctual need to restore the normalcy that my silence disrupted. I sensed their struggle to recalibrate, to find new ways of connecting without my voice as the bridge. The subtle shifts in their behavior, though disconcerting, were proof that my quiet was not invisible. It was a presence that could not be ignored. In that stillness, the house itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would come next. The unspoken questions hung in the air, thick and unresolved, while I sat quietly, grounded in the calm strength that had taken root within me. The silence was no longer just an absence of sound, it had become a force, reshaping the dynamics under this roof in ways that no single word ever could. The quiet stretched on, not as a void to be filled, but as a mirror held up to everyone beneath this roof. In the absence of my usual reactions, no sharp words, no defensive flares, no pleading explanations, the atmosphere shifted. My family, once so certain of their emotional grip, found themselves disarmed by my steady stillness. Without the usual eruptions to respond to, the familiar patterns of blame and manipulation began to lose their hold. It was as if the silence peeled back layers they had long hidden behind, forcing a reckoning with the parts of themselves they preferred to ignore. In this calm, the usual power plays fell flat. My lack of reaction was not indifference but a deliberate refusal to fuel the fire. When accusations came, they echoed against a wall that did not crack. When the old narratives tried to replay, they met a quiet that neither confirmed nor denied. This absence of engagement removed the emotional leverage that had perpetuated cycles of misunderstanding and pain. Without my usual emotional responses to bounce off of, the familiar dramas began to unravel, revealing the raw and often uncomfortable truth beneath. It wasn't about shutting down or punishing anyone with silence. Rather, it was about creating space, a space where clarity could breathe. The silence was a lens, bringing into sharp relief the dynamics that had operated in shadows for years. It allowed each person to confront their own reflections without distraction, without the noise of reactive defense. In that quiet, the house no longer echoed with accusations or demands, but held a stillness that invited introspection. The silence asked more questions than it answered, but those questions were necessary. If you've ever been told you're too dramatic for simply expressing your feelings, you know how isolating that can feel. It's as if the very act of being open becomes a reason to be silenced or dismissed. I invite you to share your experience in the comments. Sometimes, just knowing others have walked similar paths can be a quiet balm in itself. Returning to this silence was not an act of withdrawal, but a conscious choice to see clearly. It was a refusal to be drawn into cycles that no longer served growth or understanding. Underneath the same roof where so many words had been thrown like weapons, the unspoken became the most potent language of all. In choosing silence, I didn't erase what was unsaid, I illuminated it. Through this stillness, the family's reflections became unavoidable. The silence refracted back their own frustrations, fears, and hopes in ways that clamor never could. It was a subtle, steady force that demanded presence without chaos. By not reacting, I reclaimed my own space and power, and in doing so, I invited others to face themselves more honestly. The transformation was neither immediate nor easy. The silence could feel heavy, even threatening at times. Yet beneath that weight was a deep and steady pulse of clarity. It was not punishment, nor was it a retreat. It was a clear-eyed invitation to see what had long been hidden in plain sight, both in them and in me. The silence was a mirror, reflecting back the truths we all needed to confront if we were ever to move forward together. The quiet stretched between us like an invisible thread, taut and unyielding, subtly shifting the atmosphere beneath the same roof we'd shared for so long. At first, the silence was met with sharp glances and half-spoken questions, but as days turned into weeks, the family dynamic began to unravel in the most delicate and unsettling ways. Without words to anchor them, their attempts to reclaim control took on a fragile edge, small provocations, carefully measured, as if testing the limits of my quiet defiance. There was a change in the way they moved around me, like cautious dancers stepping around an unseen tension. My silence became a silent challenge, a refusal that unsettled them more than any outburst ever could. I noticed how their eyes lingered longer, searching for cracks or signs of weakness, and how the air thickened with unspoken accusations. They tried to provoke reactions with subtle barbs, half-joking remarks that barely concealed their frustration, questions loaded with expectation but wrapped in feigned concern. Each attempt felt like a tentative poke at a sleeping beast, hoping to rouse some flicker of anger or guilt. My mother's voice, usually warm and insistent, grew quieter, almost hesitant, as if unsure whether to push or retreat. In the kitchen, she would place a plate before me, then withdraw it moments later, her eyes silently pleading. My father's presence loomed heavier than ever, his jaw clenched, his usual impatience now tempered by a simmering uncertainty. They circled me like predators that had lost their usual prey, their confidence slipping with every day that passed without the expected compliance. The familiar rituals of family life, the shared meals, the casual conversations, became strained performances, rehearsed and fragile. Guilt, once wielded as a steady weapon, now faltered. Their words, when they came, bore the weight of unspoken doubt. "We just want to understand," they said, but the plea was tangled with frustration, as if their understanding was slipping through their fingers like sand. I watched as their faces shifted, shadows of doubt crossing features once so sure and commanding. I could feel the subtle tremors beneath their composed exteriors, the quiet unraveling of control that they had always taken for granted. Yet, they still tried. My sister, usually the loudest voice in the room, lowered her tone to a whisper when she spoke to me, as if afraid to break the fragile silence with too much noise. She would leave notes in places I frequented, on the bathroom mirror, tucked into a book, carefully chosen words meant to coax, to guilt, to remind me of shared memories and unspoken bonds. But each note was met with the same stillness, a refusal to engage that chipped away at their certainty. The tension between us was a quiet storm, swirling beneath the surface. It was not marked by explosive confrontations, but by a series of small, almost imperceptible shifts. A glance held a little too long, a door closed a little too sharply, a silence stretched a little too thin. The family's control, once so absolute, began to slip through their fingers, slipping away in the very space where they had always felt safe and secure. In that space, I found a strange kind of power, not in words, but in the steady calm of my silence. It was a refusal to be drawn into old patterns, a refusal to perform the roles they expected. And as the days passed, their attempts to provoke reactions only deepened the quiet fissures between us. The cracks in their facade grew wider, revealing the fragility beneath the surface of control. This quiet tension was a mirror, reflecting back not only their struggles but my own. The silence was no longer just a shield. It was a space where the family's hold loosened, where the old dynamics began to shift and realignment seemed possible. It was unsettling, yes, but also necessary, a stillness pregnant with the possibility of change, waiting to be felt rather than spoken aloud. The moment they truly realized I was no longer available, though I hadn't left the room, the house, or even the conversation, was not marked by a sudden outburst or dramatic confrontation. Instead, it crept in as an unsettling silence, a stillness that stretched longer than before and carried a weight that was impossible to ignore. Their eyes searched mine, but what they found wasn't the familiar reflection of the person they thought they could bend, persuade, or manipulate. Instead, they saw a quiet withdrawal, a retreat behind walls that no longer trembled under their influence. Their control, once so assured and seemingly unshakable, faltered visibly. It was as if the ground beneath their feet had shifted, and with every question they asked, every demand or expectation they laid before me, the space between us widened. I was there, but the connection, the emotional tether that had once tied me tightly to their world, had been severed quietly, almost imperceptibly, until it wasn't. They grasped for it, but their hands met only air. That fear, raw and palpable, began to creep into the edges of their expressions. It was the fear of losing the familiar script, the fear of a story unraveling that they had long relied upon to maintain order and certainty. They could no longer predict my responses or bend my will to fit their narrative. Their usual methods, pleading, guilt, anger, subtle threats, fell flat, ringing hollow against the barrier I had set. It wasn't rebellion in the loud sense, but a calm, unyielding withdrawal that disarmed them more effectively than any argument or outburst ever could. I remember the way their voices changed, the way the room seemed to shrink as tension thickened. The questions became less about me and more about themselves, about what was going wrong, why their influence was slipping, what had shifted beneath the surface. For the first time, they confronted the possibility that I was no longer a part of the equation the way they had always assumed. That realization sparked a quiet panic behind their eyes, a desperate grasping at control that was slipping through their fingers like sand. I wasn't angry or resentful in that moment. I was simply gone, emotionally distant, disengaged, a presence that existed but no longer participated. It was a boundary drawn in the sand, invisible but unmistakable. The conversations that once flowed easily were met now with brief answers, with a cool detachment that neither invited nor tolerated intrusion. The warmth that had once flickered between us cooled to a neutral gray, and with it, their certainty about who I was and what they could expect from me evaporated. Their fear was not just about losing me, it was about losing the illusion of control that had been their anchor. Without that, everything felt unstable and frightening. The family dynamics that had been so carefully maintained began to tremble, exposed as fragile constructs rather than unbreakable bonds. It was a turning point not just in our relationship, but in the entire atmosphere under the same roof. The unspoken tensions and unacknowledged needs that had simmered beneath the surface were suddenly impossible to ignore. What they feared most was not just my absence, but the unknown that my withdrawal represented. It was a void where certainty once lived, a silence that demanded reflection and change. For the first time, the power balance shifted, not with a clash, but with the quiet refusal to be present in the way they required. This was the moment when control slipped away, and with it, the possibility of something new, something real, began to take its fragile first breath. In the quiet that followed, I recognized how unsettling silence could be, not only for those around me but for myself. It was in that absence of noise that I was forced to confront parts of myself I had long ignored or denied. Without the distractions of constant interaction or the need to fill space with words, I was left with raw awareness. I realized that silence isn't a neutral state, it's a mirror that reflects truths I wasn't always prepared to face. The discomfort wasn't just external, it lived inside me. I saw how much of my identity had been shaped by reactions to others, by the roles I performed to maintain peace or avoid conflict. In silence, those roles lost their meaning, and I had to reckon with who I was beneath them. This reckoning revealed boundaries I had blurred or ignored. Silence became an unspoken declaration. I would no longer enable others to define my limits. I understood that boundaries are not just lines drawn to keep others out, but also shields to protect the integrity of one's own experience. Yet, setting those boundaries was neither simple nor painless. It meant risking alienation, inviting misunderstanding, and sometimes facing outright hostility. The silence I maintained was a refusal to participate in dynamics that drained me, but it also exposed me to vulnerability. I had to sit with the uncertainty of being misunderstood or dismissed. That was perhaps the hardest lesson silence taught me, that protecting myself often meant embracing discomfort rather than avoiding it. I also learned that silence holds a peculiar kind of power, one that doesn't announce itself with loud declarations or dramatic gestures. It is a power that resides in restraint, in the choice to withhold rather than to give. This power is subtle, often invisible to others, but no less real. It shifted the energy in the room, altered expectations, and unsettled the familiar patterns of control. I saw how silence could disrupt habitual cycles, how it could create space for reflection, for reconsideration, and for something previously unspoken to emerge. But this power was not about dominance or winning. It was a quiet assertion of autonomy, a way to reclaim agency when words failed or were weaponized against me. Yet silence also revealed my own limits and contradictions. There were moments when it felt like a cage, a self-imposed exile from connection and understanding. I grappled with loneliness and the fear that my silence might be mistaken for indifference or weakness. I had to navigate the precarious balance between protecting myself and remaining open enough to be real, to be seen. This tension was uncomfortable and ongoing. It forced me to question the simplistic idea that silence is always empowering or healing. Sometimes, it was messy and isolating, a landscape of unresolved feelings and unanswered questions. Through this process, I recognized that silence does not offer easy answers. It is a space where complexities remain unresolved, where discomfort lingers and clarity is hard-earned. It taught me patience with myself, with others, and with the slow, uneven work of change. It illuminated the ways in which communication is not just about speaking but also about listening, to others and to the internal voices we often suppress. Silence demanded honesty, not just in what I said but in what I chose not to say, and in understanding why. Ultimately, silence revealed the contours of my inner life with starkness and nuance. It showed me what I was willing to endure, what I needed to protect, and where I could no longer compromise. It reshaped my understanding of power, not as something to seize or impose, but as something to inhabit quietly and deliberately. The silence was not a withdrawal into nothingness but an opening into something new, fragile and uncertain, a space where I could begin to reclaim myself on my own terms. When you finally stop reacting, when you close the door on the endless cycle of emotional manipulation, those who thrived on your responses will quickly label you as dramatic, overreacting, or even cold. It's a paradox many endure but few openly acknowledge. The very people who benefit most from your vulnerability are often the ones who accuse you of being too sensitive the moment you stop giving them access to your emotions. This reaction is less about you and more about their need to maintain control, to keep you within the bounds of their narrative. Recognizing this dynamic is essential because it frees you from the trap of seeking validation from those who are invested in your silence or your pain. For anyone still living under the same roof where your feelings are dismissed, misunderstood, or weaponized, know this: your experience is valid. The emotional invalidation you face is not a reflection of your worth, but a reflection of others' inability to hold space for your truth. It's a form of quiet control that chips away at your sense of self, one unnoticed moment at a time. But in that silent space you carve out for yourself, away from their judgments and expectations, you begin to reclaim your power. You start to understand that protection and boundaries are acts of courage, not selfishness. You deserve to be heard, to be seen, and above all, to be respected within your own home. This journey is rarely linear or easy. It demands patience with yourself and the willingness to embrace uncertainty. Yet, in stepping back from the chaos of emotional entanglement, you create a new kind of strength, one rooted in presence rather than reaction, in choice rather than compulsion. You learn to inhabit your silence not as absence, but as a space of potential where healing and transformation quietly unfold. It is here, in this fragile and often lonely place, that you begin to rewrite your story away from the shadows of control and invalidation. If you find yourself still navigating the complexities of family control, emotional gaslighting, or the quiet struggles of personal liberation while living under the same roof, you are not alone. There is a community here, and together we explore these real stories with honesty and compassion. Subscribe to join us, to find strength in shared experience, and to reclaim your voice in a world that often tries to silence it. Your story matters. It deserves to be told, heard, and honored. Let's walk this path together.